I've been a photographer for 19 years. I've shot funerals, I've shot riots, I've shot a man being pulled out of a burning car in Rendholm Harbor with his hands still on the wheel. You learn, after a while, to feel a thing coming before it arrives. It's in the air. It's in the way people stand. That morning, the 11th of October, standing in a press pen outside the Vellinge gate with cold in my knuckles and my breath fogging my viewfinder, I felt nothing at all. No warning. Nothing. Which is how I know it was real. The bad ones never announce themselves. Let me set it properly, because if you weren't there you'll want to picture it. Rendholm in October is not a beautiful city. People say it is. They see the photographs, the copper roofs, the canal, the palace with its long gray face and its rows of tall windows, and they think it must be lovely to stand there. It isn't. In October, the wind comes down off the northern water and gets into the seams of the buildings, and it carries a smell of salt and wet stone and diesel from the ferry terminal, and it goes through a wool coat like the coat isn't there. I'd been in the pen since 6:20. That's the job. You don't get a good position by arriving on time. You get it by arriving stupidly early and standing in the dark with a flask of coffee and 40 other people who have all made the same bad decision with their lives. The pen was set up on the eastern side of the Vellinge gate, penned off with steel barriers and a strip of blue tape that snapped in the wind all morning like something trying to get free. Behind us, the public. In front of us, the courtyard, the gravel, the black iron of the gate, and the guard. Just one on our side, Corporal Tobias Wren, though I didn't know his name that morning. Nobody knew his name that morning. That was rather the point of him. You should understand what the household guard is in Waldheim, because people from outside always get it wrong. They see the uniform, the dark green tunic, the silver frogging, the tall black cap with the white plume that goes flat and sad in the rain, and they think it's a costume, theater for the tourists. It isn't. The household guard is a working regiment. Those men have been shot at. The one standing at the Vellinge gate that morning had done 2 tours somewhere hot and unpleasant that our government has never satisfactorily explained to anyone, and he had come home, and he had been given a plume and a post, and told to stand still. And he stood still. God, did he stand still. I photographed him a dozen times before the Queen ever came out. I do that, I fill the card early, I warm up, I find my light. He was good light. The gate faced east and the low sun came through the ironwork and laid these long bars of gold across the gravel and across his boots, and he stood in them and did not move and did not move and did not move. 68 beats. I counted once out of boredom. 68 of my own heartbeats between one blink and the next. And when he did blink, it was so small that if you weren't watching for it, you'd have missed it entirely. Beside me, Claus Nordahl from the Rendholm Tidend was eating a pastry out of a paper bag and getting flakes of it in his beard. He'd been covering the palace for 31 years. "Stop photographing the boy," he said. "He's not the story. He's the only thing here that isn't moving. He's furniture." I said without looking away from the viewfinder, "That's a horrible thing to say." Claus shrugged and ate his pastry. He wasn't being cruel. He was being a palace correspondent, which is nearly the same thing but pays worse. It was the anniversary, 11 years. I want to be careful here, because if you're not from Waldheim, you'll hear the word princess and you'll picture something soft, and Adelia was not soft. Princess Adelia married into the House of Wald when she was 23 and spent the next 19 years being not quite what anybody wanted. She was too tall. She laughed too loudly at things that weren't funny and didn't laugh at all at things that were supposed to be. She turned up at a fisherman's strike in Hallesund in a borrowed anorak and stood in the rain for 6 hours and let a man who hadn't been paid in 4 months shout at her about it. And she did not defend herself, and she did not leave. And when he finished, she said, "This is documented. There's tape of it," she said. "Say it again, and slower, because I am going to repeat it to my husband tonight, and I want to get it right." Nobody in the palace ever forgave her for that. Everybody else did, immediately and permanently. She died on a road outside Castrop when I was 29 years old. I remember precisely where I was standing. Everyone does. In this country, you can ask a stranger at a bus stop, and they will tell you what they were holding when they heard. And 11 years on the 11th of October, the royal family stands at the Velenge gate, and there is a wreath, and there is a silence, and there is a bell. That's all it's supposed to be. Wreath, silence, bell, 12 minutes. By 9:30, the crowd behind us was 4 deep and growing. They were not tourists. That's the thing people got wrong afterwards, in all the coverage. They showed the wide shots and said the crowds gathered as if it were a spectacle, as if these were people who'd come for a show. They weren't. It was a Tuesday. Those people had taken the morning off work. I turned around at one point and shot the crowd instead of the gate, and I still have those frames, and I'll tell you what's in them. A man in a delivery driver's fleece with his van keys still in his fist. 2 nurses in scrubs under their coats, standing shoulder to shoulder, must have come straight off a night shift. An old woman in a plastic rain bonnet holding a single white flower that she had clearly bought that morning from the stall by the tram stop, because it still had the little paper collar on it. Children on shoulders. A lot of children on shoulders. Kids who were not born when she died, who know her the way I know the war as photographs, and as the way their parents' faces change. Nobody was talking much. That's what I remember most. 400 people, and the loudest thing in that square was the blue tape snapping on the barrier, and somewhere back near the tram stop, a busker who hadn't got the memo, playing something jaunty on an accordion until the crowd turned and looked at him all at once, and he stopped mid-bar and packed up and went away. You could hear gulls. You could hear the flag on the palace roof. And you could hear, very faintly, the leather of the guard's crossbelt creak when he breathed. Claus nudged me at 20 to 10. "Look at your boy," he said. I looked. Tobias Wren, the boy, the furniture, had not moved, but something about the quality of his stillness had changed, and I've thought about how to describe this for 11 months now, and I still can't do it properly. He was standing exactly as he had been standing at 6:30. Same posture, same eyes forward, same rifle at the same angle. But at 6:30, he had been waiting. Now he was listening. I don't know how you tell the difference, but you can. Anyone can. Watch a dog in a room where something is about to happen. It's the same thing exactly. His jaw had set, just slightly, and his eyes, which had been aimed at the middle distance in that unfocused 1,000-meter way that they teach them, had come in, sharpened. He was looking at something. I followed the line of it, and the line of it went to the doors. The great doors of the Velenge wing, under the arch, at the top of the 11 shallow stone steps. They were opening. Here is where I have to slow down. Because everything I've told you so far is scene setting, and I could be wrong about some of it. The number of people, the flower, whether the busker really did stop or whether I've built that detail because it makes a better story. Memory is a liar and photographers are worse. But what happens next I have on a memory card. I have it in 1,400 frames, and I have looked at those frames more times than is good for a person, and I can tell you exactly what happened and in what order, because the camera does not embellish and the camera does not want anything. At 09:47 and 11 seconds, the doors of the Velenge wing opened. The king came out first. Alaric is 66 now, and he has the walk of a man whose knees have been rebuilt twice. He came down the steps slowly, one hand not quite touching the balustrade, in a dark coat and a black tie, and he looked, I'll say it, he looked like a man attending a funeral, which after 11 years is either very moving or slightly self-indulgent depending on how you feel about him, and this country has never made up its mind. Behind him, Crown Prince Emric, 34, Adelia's son. And the resemblance is so brutal it makes people gasp. Same height, same long jaw, same way of holding the shoulders slightly back as though bracing for a wind. When he steps out into a crowd, There's always a noise, a kind of low collective oh, and there was that morning too. I got it in the frame. His face is very still and very closed, and he is very, very good at this now, and he was not always, and you can see the not always underneath if you know where to look. Behind him, the younger one, Prince Cassian, 29, who was 18 when his mother died and has never once said her name in public. And then last at the king's right shoulder, in a coat of dark gray wool with a high collar. The Queen. Marguerite. Say the name in a bar in Rendholm, and watch what happens to the room. She was Marguerite Sandvik before she was anything, and she was the king's well. The word people use is friend, and the word people mean is not friend, and whether the timeline supports the word people mean has been litigated in this country for 15 years in every kitchen and every taxi, and it has never been settled, and it never will be. She married him 4 years after Adelia died. 4 years is either a decent interval or an obscenity, depending, again, on how you feel, and this country has never made up its mind about that either. She is a handsome woman. Not beautiful, handsome, which is a harder and more useful thing. Gray now, and she doesn't dye it, and I have always thought better of her for that, and I say this as someone who is about to describe her having the worst morning of her public life. She came down the steps, and she stood a half-pace behind the king, exactly where she is always taught to stand, and her hands were folded, and her face was arranged into the expression she has been wearing in this square for 11 years, grave, respectful, and just slightly tentative, like a guest at a wake who isn't sure if she's allowed to eat. Claus exhaled through his teeth beside me. "There she is," he said. "Bless her, she hates this one." "Wouldn't you?" "Every year," he said. "Every single year she has to come out and stand under that woman's shadow and be photographed doing it. And I remember this precisely, and I'm not proud of it. I remember thinking, poor cow. I actually felt sorry for her. I want that on the record, because of what I did about 90 seconds later. The bell hadn't started yet. There's a whole choreography to these things. The family come down, they take position at the foot of the steps, the Lord Chamberlain does something with a wreath, and then the bell at St. Wilhelm's begins, and it tolls 11 times, and the whole square stands silent through it. So we had maybe 2 minutes of dead air, the family in position, 400 people not making a sound, 40 photographers doing what 40 photographers do, which is fire off frames on the off chance. I was shooting the Crown Prince. Everyone shoots the Crown Prince. He's the money, he's the face, he's Adelia looking back at you out of a man's body on the anniversary of her death. And if you get the right frame of him, it runs on the front page of 6 countries. I had a good one. His jaw was doing a thing. And then the sun came out. That's all it was. That's the whole hinge of it. The clouds over the eastern roofline had been thick and low all morning, and at 09, 49 and 40 seconds they broke, and a wedge of hard white autumn sunlight came across the top of the Velenge wing and down the steps and across the gravel. It hit the king on the shoulder. It hit the Crown Prince across the eyes, and he flinched, very slightly, and that ruined my frame. And it hit the Queen full on the chest. And something on her chest threw it back at me. I've been blinded by flare and a viewfinder 10,000 times. It's nothing. You swear, you shift your feet, you shoot again. But this wasn't flare. This was a point. A single hard white star, so bright in the finder that it left a green afterimage when I pulled my eye off the cup, and I remember actually blinking and rubbing my eye with the back of my wrist like an idiot. I looked at her with my naked eye. She was wearing a brooch on the left lapel of the gray coat, which was not unusual. She wears a brooch to every state function. Every woman in that family does. There's a vault under the palace with 300 years of them in it, and they are worn according to a protocol so Byzantine that there is a man employed full-time to advise on it. Blue stone, silver setting, small. From 22 meters it was a bright chip on a gray coat and nothing more. I put the long lens on it because I am a professional, and because the light was doing something nice, and for absolutely no other reason in the world. I want to be extremely clear about this. I have said it in a deposition and I'll say it here. I was not looking for it. I did not know. I put a 400mm lens on the Queen of Waldheim's lapel because the sun came out and it sparkled. That's it, that's how it happened. The whole thing turned on a gap in the clouds. The image came up sharp. And I stopped breathing. Now, you have to understand something about me, and it's the thing that made me the wrong person or the right person, depending, to be standing in that pen that morning. In 2011, I spent 4 months on a book. A picture book, a coffee table thing commissioned by a publisher in Hallesund, and it was called Adelia, The Working Years, and it was a catalog of every public appearance she made between her marriage and her death. I did the picture research. All of it. 19 years of photographs, 400 and some engagements, 30,000 frames from 12 agencies, and I sat in a basement in Hallesund for 4 months and I looked at all of them. And when you do that, when you look at one woman for 4 months, you stop seeing the woman. You start seeing the objects, because the woman is always different and the objects are always the same, and the objects are how you date the pictures when the caption's been lost. I knew her watches. I knew her shoes. I knew the 3 coats she wore to death and the 1 green dress that appears in 11 years of pictures and then, in 1997, stops. And I knew, the way I know my own hands, the Wintermere star. It was a gift, given to Adelia by the old queen, the king's mother, who by every account could not stand her, in 1989, 3 months after the wedding, which is either a peace offering or a message and nobody's ever agreed which. The stone is a Ceylon sapphire, 22 carats, and it is not a good stone. That's the thing. It's a famous stone and it's a large stone, but any gemologist will tell you it's slightly clouded, and it has an inclusion near the girdle that you can see with the naked eye if you know where to look, a little feathered flaw like a crack in ice. And it was cut in the old style as a cushion, squarish, soft-cornered, deep. And it was set in a silver mount that the old queen's grandmother had commissioned in 1911, and that mount was ugly. Genuinely, objectively ugly. Heavy silverwork, blackened with age, laid out in 8 thick rays around the stone so that the whole thing looked less like a star than like a spider sitting on your coat. Adelia wore it constantly. Constantly. To openings, to hospitals, to the fishermen in Hallesund. She wore it to the Vellinge ball in a dress that did not suit it, and she wore it on a factory floor in Kastrup over a high-vis vest, which is on the cover of my book, and she is laughing, and the great ugly spider of a thing is sitting on her chest catching the light off a stamping press. There was an interview. 1994, television, and the interviewer, a smug little man, long dead, asked her why she wore that particular brooch so often when she had, and he said this on air, so many prettier things available. And she said, because it isn't pretty. It's got a flaw right through the middle of it and it's too heavy, and it pulls my coat out of shape, and somebody who didn't like me very much gave it to me anyway. I think that's rather the most honest thing I own. Every person in this country over the age of 30 can quote that. It's on tea towels. And I was looking at it through a 400mm lens on the Queen Consort's lapel on the 11th of October. Except the stone was wrong. The color was right, that deep, slightly inky Ceylon blue, and you can't fake that. Or you can, but not on a coat at 22 meters in October sun. But it was cushion no longer. Somebody had recut it. It had been brought to an oval, and it had been brought up shallower, and the effect of that, and any jeweler will tell you this, it's why they do it, the effect of that is to make the stone throw light like a knife. It was flashing. Adelia's brooch never flashed. It sat there, dark and heavy and slightly sullen like a bruise. This one was a star. Somebody had made it into a star. And the flaw was gone. That little feathered crack in the ice near the girdle. Gone. Cut away, because when you recut a stone you cut out. That's the whole business. You take the flaw and you take the carrots around it and you throw them away and you polish what's left. The Windermere star was 22 carats. The thing on the queen's coat was, I'd have said 15. 16 at the outside. 6 carats of a dead woman's sapphire, cut off and gone. And the setting, God, the setting. Somebody had taken the ugly Edwardian spider and fixed it, melted it down or thrown it out and replaced it with a slim, modern, entirely tasteful little claw mount in white gold. 6 neat prongs, no raise, no weight, nothing to pull a coat out of shape. They had taken the most honest thing she owned, and they had made it pretty. I did not shout. I want to be clear, because there were later in certain newspapers some very creative accounts of what I did in that pen, and one of them has me climbing the barrier, which I did not do, and one of them has me weeping, which I'll come back to. What I actually did was lower the camera and say, out loud, in a normal speaking voice to nobody, "That's been cut." Claus said, "What?" I said, "Claus, that's been cut." And Claus Nordahl, who had been covering the palace for 31 years, who was 62 years old and had a pastry in his hand, and had not looked up from his own viewfinder, said, "What has?" and then stopped, and went very slowly still, and put down the pastry, onto the top of the steel barrier, which was wet. He put a pastry down on a wet barrier without looking at it, and I have thought about that ever since, because I think that's the moment I knew I hadn't lost my mind. He put the long lens up. 31 years of the palace. He looked for about 4 seconds. And Claus said, very quietly, in the voice of a man who has just watched a car go off a bridge, "Oh, they haven't." The thing about a press pen is that it is 40 people standing in a line, all of whom are professionally paranoid, all of whom are watching each other out of the sides of their eyes at all times, because the only thing worse than missing the shot is missing the shot that the man next to you got. Claus Nordahl put down a pastry and swung a long lens onto the queen's lapel. Inez Fahlberg was already there. And the woman from the agency on my left, whose name I have never known, saw 2 people she respected pointing 400 millimeters of glass at a piece of jewelry, and she did the only sane thing, and she swung her lens onto it too. And the man beyond her saw her do it. It went down the pen like a wave, like dominoes, like something in a physics lecture. 6 seconds, maybe 7, from Claus putting the pastry down to the entire Eastern press pen, every single lens, 41 of us, pivoting as one body away from the Crown Prince of Waldheim and onto a 4-centimeter object on a gray wool coat. I have never heard a sound like the sound the shutters made. And then it went past the barrier. That's what nobody outside understands. The crowd, 400 people, 10 meters behind us, most of whom had taken the morning off work to stand in the cold and be quiet for a woman who's been dead 11 years, and every one of them was watching us, because we were the only thing to watch. They saw the pen turn. And they didn't know what it meant, but they knew it meant something, and the ones at the front started craning, and the ones behind started asking the ones in front, and a sound began. Not a shout, nothing so clean. It was a murmur. It started at the barrier and it went backwards through 400 people in about 8 seconds, and it changed pitch as it went. It started as a question, and it turned into something else halfway through the crowd, and I don't have a word for what it turned into. And I'll tell you the exact moment I knew we were finished. I'll tell you the sound. Somewhere back there, 20 meters back in the middle of it, invisible, a woman's voice. Not a young voice. It went up over the murmur, high and cracked and absolutely bewildered, and she said one word, and the word was Adelia's. And on the gravel, in the bars of light, 3 meters from the barrier, with his rifle at the same angle it had been at for 4 hours and 11 minutes. The guard's eyes moved. Just his eyes. He was facing forward, out at the pen, out at the crowd. He could not turn his head because turning his head is a thing they will have you for, and he did not turn his head. But his eyes came off the middle distance, and they went left, and they went up, 11 shallow stone steps and along a coat of dark gray wool, and they stopped on her lapel. And I had a camera up and I was firing at 11 frames a second, and I have that. I have the frame. It's the third of a burst and it's slightly soft because I was on him at f4 and I hadn't reset from the prince. And it doesn't matter because you can see it perfectly. Corporal Tobias Wren, Household Guard, Vellinge Gate, 0951 on the 11th of October, looking at the Wintermere star. And his jaw is doing something. The bell at St. Wilhelm's began to toll. Right then. Right at that moment, because it was 10 o'clock and the bell does not care. 400 people were supposed to fall silent. They did not fall silent. 3. The bell at St. Wilhelm's is a 19th century bell, and it has a long, ugly, flat-bottomed tone that hangs in the air for about 6 seconds and then dies badly. And for 11 years I have stood in that square and listened to it toll 11 times over 400 silent people, and I will tell you that it is one of the most affecting sounds I have ever heard in my life. It was not affecting that morning. 4. That morning it was just noise. A great stupid tin noise banging away over the top of something that was already happening, like an alarm clock going off in a house that's already on fire. 5. Nobody was silent. The murmur had not stopped for the bell, it had gone under it, the way water goes under a door, and it was still moving, and it was getting worse in the gaps between the tolls. You'd hear the bell, and then in the 6 seconds of decay you'd hear 400 people talking, and then the bell again, and then more of them talking, and each time there were more. 6. I remember thinking with a kind of detached horror, they're going to keep ringing it. 11. It has to go to 11. Somebody up in that tower with a rope has no idea, and he is going to stand there and ring it 5 more times into this. 7. Claus had his phone out. He was holding the camera in his left hand, hanging by the strap, which no photographer does. A body and a long lens is 4 kilos, and you do not swing it around by the strap. And he had his phone in his right, and he was typing with his thumb fast, and his thumb was not steady. I said, Claus, don't. He didn't look up. Claus, don't. You don't know what you're looking at. And Claus Nordahl, 62 years old, 31 years of the palace, said without lifting his eyes from the screen, Inez, I have looked at that brooch through a lens more times than I have looked at my own wife. 8. It could be a copy, I said. It could be a paste copy. They make copies. They wear copies when they travel. It's not a copy. You don't know. And he stopped, and he looked up, and his eyes were red-rimmed and furious in a way I had never once seen on that man, not in 19 years, not at the harbor fire, not at anything. He said, the stone is smaller, Inez. 9. Why, he said, would anyone make a copy that's smaller? That's the thing that did it. That's the argument that ended the argument, and it ended it in about a second and a half, and it went through the pen and then through the crowd, and then, within 40 minutes, through the entire country. Because he was right. That was the whole case, right there, and it never got any more complicated than that. You copy a thing to make it look the same. Nobody in the history of the world has ever made a fake of a famous jewel and made it 4 grams lighter. There's no reason. There's no motive. A copy is a lie that wants to be believed, and this thing wasn't lying about anything. It was sitting there in the sun on the Queen's lapel, flashing like a lighthouse, and telling the absolute truth, which was that somebody, somewhere, at some point in the last 11 years, had put Adelia's sapphire on a wheel and taken 6 carats off it. 10. I got my long lens back up. Because that is what I am in the end. There is a version of me that is a person, and there is a version of me that is a machine that raises a camera when something happens. And on the 11th of October at 09:52 in the morning, the machine won, and I am neither proud nor ashamed of that. It's just true. 11. And the bell stopped. And that was so much worse. The silence after the 11th toll is the sacred part. That's the bit. 15 seconds of nothing in a square with 400 people in it, and you can hear the gulls and the flag and the tape on the barrier. And every year I have stood in that pen and felt something go up the back of my neck. The 11th toll died away. And what came up underneath it was 400 people talking, and it was not a murmur anymore. I want to try and describe this properly, because the footage doesn't do it. The broadcast footage has the boom mics on the family, and the ambient is way down in the mix, and you watch it back, and it sounds like a bit of restlessness in a crowd. It wasn't restlessness, it was a sound. It was low. That's the thing that frightened me. I've been in a football stadium when a goal goes in and that's a high sound. It's up at the top of your hearing, it's joy or it's outrage, and either way it's up. This was down. It was in the chest. 400 people, most of them not shouting, most of them just talking, all at once, all in the same low register. And the effect of that in a stone courtyard is that the noise comes off the walls and it doesn't sound like people anymore. It sounds like a machine somewhere underground. And there were phones, God, the phones. You have to understand, this crowd had come to be quiet. Almost nobody had a phone up when the family came out. That's not how people behave at this thing. It never has been. There's an unwritten rule and everybody in this country obeys it. And the year some tourist filmed the wreath on a selfie stick, he got such a look from an old man in the crowd that he put it away and left. By 09:53, there were 400 phones in the air. I turned around and shot it. I've got that frame too, and it's in every retrospective, and I've been paid for it more times than I can count, and I would give it back. 400 screens all lit, all pointed at one woman on a set of steps. It looks like a field of little gray stones. It looks like a graveyard standing up. The family knew. That's the part people won't believe, but I was 22 meters away with 400 millimeters of glass, and I watched it land on all four of them, one after another, and I know exactly what I saw. The king went first, and he went the way old men in that job go. He went nowhere. Total shutdown. He was standing with his hands folded and his chin up, and he did not so much as flicker. That man has been head of state for 31 years, and he has been booed, and he has been cheered, and he has been shot at once in 2003. And I promise you he heard that sound come up off the square, and he understood it completely, and he did not give it a millimeter. His face just closed. Like a shop. Prince Cassian, the younger one, looked at the crowd. You're not supposed to. You look at the middle distance. He looked straight at them, and he was clearly trying to work out what they were doing, and he had the expression of a man in a dream who's realized something is wrong with the room but can't identify what, and it is a terrible thing to see on a 29-year-old's face. The queen did not move at all. And then Imric turned his head. The crown prince turned his head and he looked at the crowd, and then his eyes tracked, and I saw them track. I watched it happen in real time, and it took perhaps 2 seconds. His eyes tracked from the crowd to the press pen, and along the pen, along 41 lenses, all of which were pointing at a spot 2 meters to his right and slightly behind him. And he followed the line of them. And he turned and looked at his stepmother's coat. I have 4 frames of what happened to the crown prince's face, and I have never sold them, and I never will. 2 agencies have offered me money that would have changed my life. There is one frame in particular, the second one, and there is nothing in this world that would make me put it in a newspaper. He was 34 years old, and he was standing on a set of steps at his mother's memorial, and he found out, in public, in front of 400 people and 41 cameras, at the same instant that they did. Nobody had told him. That's the thing. That's the thing I have never been able to get past, and it is the reason this stopped being a story about a piece of jewelry for me at about 09:53 and a half in the morning. Nobody had told him. Somebody in that palace had taken his mother's brooch to a workshop and put it on a wheel and cut 6 carats off it and melted down the setting. And then somebody had put it in a box, and then somebody had handed the box to the queen consort on the morning of the anniversary. And at no point in that entire chain of events had anyone thought, or anyone dared, to go and knock on the door of the man whose mother it belonged to. He found out from the crowd. He didn't shout. He didn't say anything. He looked at it for the frame, say 2.5 seconds, and then he faced front again, and his face went as closed as his father's, exactly as closed. And I saw the moment he did it, and it was like watching a door shut. And then he did the thing that broke me. He took one step. One sideways to his left, about 40 centimeters. Away from her. That step is in the broadcast footage. It's the only part of this that's in the broadcast footage, because the broadcast cameras were on the family and not on the coat, and for about 6 hours that clip was the entire story before my frames came out. 40 centimeters. The Crown Prince of Waldheim on the 11th of October, moving 40 centimeters away from his stepmother on a set of stone steps. Half the country saw a grieving son. Half the country saw a man publicly repudiating the Queen of Waldheim in front of 400 witnesses. They were both right. That's what nobody wants to hear. They were both completely right, and they have been screaming at each other about it ever since. And Marguerite. Now I have to talk about her, and I have to do it fairly, and it is going to be difficult, because I do not like her, and I have never liked her, and I have been photographing her for 15 years. She had not moved. Not once. Not through the murmur, not through the phones, not through the sound coming up off the square like a train under the floor, not through her stepson stepping away from her in front of the world. Her hands were folded. Her chin was at the correct angle. Her face was arranged in exactly the expression she had come down the steps wearing, and she held it, and she held it, and she did not so much as move her eyes. And I got in tight on her, I mean tight. I filled the frame with her face, and I fired, and I looked at those frames that night in a hotel room with a bottle of something, and I want to tell you what's in them, because I don't think anyone else on earth saw it. She knew. Not at the end. Not when Emmerich stepped away, not when the noise started. She knew before. I went back. I went back through the whole card, right back to 09:47 when the doors opened, and I put them up big, and I went frame by frame. And she came down those 11 steps with her hands folded and her chin up and her face perfectly arranged. And on step 4, before the sun came out, before the clouds broke, before a single lens had turned, before anything at all had happened, she swallowed. And her eyes came down, just for a moment, down and to the left. And she looked at her own lapel. She knew. She came out of that door knowing precisely what was pinned to her coat and precisely what it was going to do. And she walked down 11 steps into a courtyard with 400 people in it, and she stood there, and she let it happen to her. And then for the next 4 minutes, while it detonated, while the pen turned, while the phones went up, while the sound came off the walls, while her husband's son stepped away from her in front of the world, she did not move a muscle. I don't know what that is. I have thought about it for 11 months. You could call it arrogance. Half this country did. You could call it guilt so total that it had gone past feeling like anything. Or you could call it, and I have to say this, and it costs me something to say it, you could call it a woman standing in a courtyard and taking it. Because she had been given something to wear, and there was no version of that morning where she took it off and went out without it. Because you do not do that. Because the protocol is the protocol, and the Queen Consort of Waldheim does not walk out of a memorial appearance over a brooch. She could have gone out and taken it off. She'd have humiliated somebody. It would have been in a different way, and it would have been a different scandal, and it would have been her scandal. Instead, she wore it, and she stood there, and she let 400 people look at it, and she did not defend herself. Which is, when you think about it, and I did not think about this for a long time, and when I finally did, I had to go and stand outside for a while. Which is, when you think about it, more or less exactly what Adelia did in the rain in Halisund. I don't know. Put that in the pile with everything else about this that will never be resolved. At 09:54 the pen went feral. There's no other word. It had been 41 professionals doing a job, and it stopped being that, and it became 41 people fighting. The problem was position. I was on the end of the pen at the eastern edge, which meant I had a beautiful clean angle onto her left lapel, the lapel with the brooch on it, and there were maybe 6 of us with that line. Everybody else in that pen was 30 degrees further west, and from 30 degrees further west you are shooting the side of the brooch, and the side of a brooch is nothing. The side of a brooch is a gray coat with a bright chip on it. It's worthless. 35 photographers understood, more or less simultaneously, that the biggest story of their careers was happening 2 meters in front of them, and they could not see it. So they came east. You have to picture a steel pen, 10 meters long, with 41 people, and about 180,000 euros of glass in it, and 35 of those people all deciding to move to the same corner. Somebody went into my back, hard, with a monopod, and I went into the barrier, and the barrier went about 10 centimeters, and the leg of it came off the tape. I heard glass go. I don't know whose. Somebody's lens hit the top rail, and there was a crack that every person in that pen heard even over the crowd, and there was a moment of absolute animal silence, and then somebody said something I won't repeat, and it started again. A man I'd known for a decade, Petter, an agency guy, decent man, godfather to somebody's child, put his hand flat on my shoulder and pushed, to get past me to the corner, and I turned round and screamed in his face. Genuinely screamed. And he screamed back. 2 grown professionals in their 40s screaming into each other's faces over a sightline, while a bell tower stood empty over a square full of crying people. That's what it does. That's what a story like that does to a room. I'm not excusing it, I'm telling you. The barrier moved again. And this time it moved properly. A whole section of it, maybe 3 meters, walked forward about half a meter on the gravel with a sound like a filing cabinet being dragged, because 41 people were leaning on it and the wind was in the tape and it just went. And behind us, the crowd, 400 people who had watched the press pen turn into a brawl, who had seen the barrier move, who had 400 phones in the air and a low sound coming out of them, and no idea what was happening, and no one telling them anything. The crowd came forward. Not a charge, please understand. Nobody in that crowd was rushing the palace. There was no violence in it at all. It was worse than that in a way. It was just a pressure. It was 400 people, each of whom took 1 step forward because the person in front of them had, and each of whom was straining to see. And 1 step by 400 people is not 1 step. It is a wall of human beings moving 3 meters closer to a line of steel that is already unbolted from its neighbor and walking on gravel. And there were children in that crowd, on shoulders. And there was an old woman in a plastic rain bonnet who had bought a white flower that morning at the tram stop, and she was somewhere in the middle of it, and she was 70 if she was a day. There were 4 household guard on the eastern approach, and one of them was Corporal Tobias Wren, and he was the nearest man to the pen by about 9 meters. And the barrier walked. I was on the ground. I want to be honest about where I was, because I have read a great many accounts of the next 90 seconds by people who were not there, and by 2 people who were there, and have lied about it. I went down on 1 knee when the barrier moved, because a monopod went into the back of my thigh and my leg folded, and I stayed down, and I have a bruise-shaped memory of gravel through the knee of my trousers and the smell of it, wet gravel and diesel and somebody's aftershave. And I stayed down because down was safer. And because down was, I am ashamed to say, a very good angle. I was on one knee at the eastern end of a collapsing press pen with a 400mm lens, and 30 centimeters from my face there was a steel barrier grinding forward across gravel, and beyond it there was open ground, and beyond that there was the guard. And I turned the camera on him. Of course I did. Of course I bloody did. And so, for the next 90 seconds, I have Corporal Tobias Wren from 30 centimeters off the deck, at 11 frames a second, in hard low autumn sun, in perfect focus. And there is not another photographer on this earth who has what I have, and it has paid for my mother's care home, and I would burn every frame of it if you gave me the choice, and told me it would put that morning back the way it was. He had not moved. 4 minutes, the bell, the murmur, the phones, the pen going up, the glass breaking, the barrier walking. Corporal Tobias Wren stood at his post in the bars of light with his rifle at the same angle it had been at for 4 hours and 16 minutes, and he had not moved, and he did not move now. And I got in on his face. He was young. That's the first thing you see when you get that close. From 20 meters he's a uniform. From 30 centimeters with 400 mil he's a boy, 26, 27, with a shaving nick under his jaw on the left side that he'd got that morning, going too fast in bad light in a barracks bathroom, the way every man does. His face was wet. Not tears. It was the wind off the northern water, which had been in our faces since 6:30 and had been in his for longer, and his eyes were streaming from it the way everybody's were, and there were 2 clean tracks down through the cold flush on his cheeks, and they meant nothing, and I have had to explain that to journalists 40 times and half of them printed it anyway. But under the cheek, right at the hinge of the jaw, there was a muscle going. Fast, in and out, like something under a sheet. And his eyes were on the steps. He was not looking at the barrier. He was not looking at the crowd. He was not looking at me, on my knees, 30 centimeters away, taking his photograph. Corporal Tobias Wren was staring from his post, in front of the whole world, straight up 11 shallow stone steps at the Windermere Star, and his jaw was going, and his eyes were absolutely, completely dry underneath the wind. And in frame 1166, which is the one they used, which is the one on the cover of the report, which is the one that ended up on the side of a building in Castrop. In frame 1166, you can see, in perfect focus, hanging out from under the left cuff of his tunic, about a centimeter of something that should not have been there. Not regulation, not silver, not braid. A thin band of cloth, dirty white, or it had been white once, frayed at the edge, tied around his wrist under the uniform the way you'd tie something you didn't want anyone to see, and pulled out from under the cuff by the way he was gripping the rifle. I didn't see it that morning. Nobody did. I found it 11 days later at 3 in the morning at a kitchen table in Hallesund with a bottle of something and a loop, and I sat there, and I looked at it for about an hour without moving. I'll get to it. The barrier came off its neighbor with a sound like a bone breaking. And a man in a delivery driver's fleece, with his van keys still in his fist, went through the gap and onto the gravel of the Vellinge courtyard, and he was not attacking anyone. He had simply been pushed, and he stumbled 4 or 5 steps into the open with his arms out and a look of total bewilderment on his face. And behind him, through the gap, came the crowd. And Corporal Tobias Wren was 9 meters away, and he was the only man between 400 people and the King of Waldheim. And he moved.